Welcome to the Deep Dive. We're about to plunge into a case that, well, it's fascinated and troubled people for years. A really complex story.
Yeah, it really is. We're looking at the murder of Hae Min Lee and the conviction of Adnan Syed. We've got a source here that tracks it all from the very beginning right up to the latest developments.
And it's quite a journey. More than 2 decades, multiple trials, appeals. It's a lot.
It is. So our mission today is basically to walk you through this timeline. We want to unpack the key moments, the evidence that caused so much debate, and how the legal system handled it all.
Okay, let's start at the beginning. Baltimore County, Maryland, January 1999.
Right. A high school student, Hae Min Lee, disappears on January 13th.
And tragically, her body is found about a month later, February 9th, in Lincoln Park.
The autopsy confirmed she was killed by manual strangulation.
The police investigation pretty quickly focused on her ex-boyfriend, Adnan Syed.
He was arrested at the end of February 28th, 1999. Apparently, there was an anonymous tip.
And then there's another key figure, Jay Wilds, a friend of Adnan's.
Yeah, Jay's role is huge. He confessed to helping Adnan bury Hae's body. He said Adnan admitted to the murder.
And his testimony became, well, absolutely critical for the prosecution.
Foundational, really. They relied heavily on his account of that day.
So that sets the stage. Adnan Syed goes on trial. The first one was in December 1999.
But that one didn't actually finish. It ended in a mistrial.
Why was that?
Well, our source says the jury overheard an argument during a sidebar. The defense attorney, Cristina Gutierrez, felt the judge called her a liar, and she said it out loud, within earshot.
Wow. Okay, so not ideal. That led to a second trial pretty quickly, February 2000.
Right, and this one went all the way. About 6 weeks long.
And the verdict.
On February 25th, 2000, guilty. First-degree murder, kidnapping, false imprisonment, robbery.
The sentence was life plus 30 years.
Exactly. Meanwhile, Jay Wilds, who cooperated...
You got a plea deal, right?
Yeah. 5-year suspended sentence, 2 years probation. For being an accessory after the fact, much, much later.
So Adnan Syed tries to appeal the conviction directly.
He did, yeah. But those initial direct appeals didn't go anywhere. They were unsuccessful.
Which often, that might be the end of the road.
You'd think so. But in this case, it was really just the start of the next phase, the post-conviction process.
Right. So years go by, and then in May 2010, Syed files for post-conviction relief.
And his main argument was ineffective assistance of counsel. He claimed Cristina Gutierrez hadn't represented him properly.
A big part of that claim centered on a potential alibi witness.
Yes, Asia McLean. She said she saw Adnan in the Woodlawn High School library around 2:30 p.m. on the day Hae disappeared.
Which is important because the state's timeline put the murder happening around that time, but miles away at a Best Buy parking lot.
Exactly. So if Asia was right, it completely contradicted the prosecution's timeline.
But the judge, Judge Welch, initially denied this claim in January 2014.
He did. He suggested that Gutierrez might have had a strategic reason not to call Asia. Maybe her timeline didn't quite mesh with Adnan's own recollection or something.
But Syed's team appealed that decision.
They did. And the case got sent back, remanded, specifically to look again at Asia's claim, especially because she'd provided a new affidavit.
Okay, so the alibi issue is back on the table, but there was another major piece of evidence coming under scrutiny around this time too, right?
Oh, yeah. The cell tower data. This was huge at the original trial.
The state used records from Adnan's phone to place him in certain locations, supposedly corroborating Jay's story, especially about burying the body in Lincoln Park.
Right. But the defense started questioning how reliable that data really was for pinpointing location back in 1999. Especially for incoming calls.
There was that disclaimer note on the fax cover sheet, wasn't there?
Exactly. A note from AT&T saying location data for incoming calls wasn't reliable for determining location, and the state had used incoming call pings for some key locations, like Lincoln Park.
So this all led to the post-conviction hearing being reopened in late 2015.
Yep, November 2015, and then there was a 5-day hearing in February 2016.
And Asia McLean testified in person this time.
She did. She stood by her story about seeing Adnan in the library.
So what was the outcome of that hearing? June 2016.
Judge Welch made a pretty big ruling. He granted Adnan Syed a new trial, vacated the conviction.
Wow. On what grounds? Was it the alibi?
Actually, no. It was the cell tower evidence. Judge Welch ruled that Gutierrez was ineffective, but specifically because she failed to properly challenge the state's expert about the reliability issues with that cell tower data. especially given the disclaimer about incoming calls.
So conviction overturned, new trial ordered, but based on the cell phone evidence issue, not the alibi.
Correct. A huge development, but Adnan remained in custody while the state figured out its next move.
Which predictably was to appeal.
Of course. The state appealed Judge Welch's decision to grant the new trial.
And this went to the Maryland Court of Special Appeals. What did they say? March 2018?
They actually agreed with the outcome. They upheld the decision to grant a new trial. But they based it on the alibi issue, not the cell towers. They felt Gutierrez's failure to even contact Asia McClain was ineffective assistance and that it could have prejudiced the trial outcome.
So two different courts, two different reasons, but the same result. New trial?
Yeah.
Seems like it's finally happening.
You'd think. But the state appealed again, this time to Maryland's highest court, the Court of Appeals.
And what happened there? This was March 2019.
Another twist. The split decision, 4-3. They reversed the lower courts. They denied the new trial. The conviction was reinstated.
Back on again. Seriously, how did they justify that?
Well, the majority agreed Gutierrez's performance was deficient regarding the alibi. They agreed she should have contacted Asia. But, they said, even if she had, it wasn't reasonably probable it would have changed the jury's verdict, given all the other evidence. That's the prejudice part of the ineffective counsel test. They felt Asia's testimony wouldn't have been enough to create a substantial possibility of a different outcome.
And the cell tower issue.
They ruled that argument was waived, basically forfeited, because Syed hadn't raised it properly in his original post-conviction petition back in 2010.
So, legally stuck. Did Syed's team have any other options?
They tried the U.S. Supreme Court, but in November 2019, the court declined to hear the case.
So, at that point, after all those appeals, the conviction seemed legally solid again.
It really did. But, we can't talk about this period without mentioning the elephant in the room.
Imperial.
Exactly. The podcast, season 1, back in late 2014, it just blew the case wide open in terms of public awareness.
The nominal reach, millions and millions of downloads. Suddenly everyone was talking about Adnan Syed, Hae Min Lee, Jay, the cell towers, the alibi.
Absolutely. And that intense public interest definitely fueled further investigation and media coverage.
Like the Undisclosed podcast, which started in 2015. They really dug deep into the case files.
Yeah, they surfaced a lot of details. Some say their work directly led to things like the state's cell phone expert revisiting his original testimony years later.
And then there was the HBO documentary in 2019, The Case Against Adnan Syed.
Right, which revealed things like Adnan apparently turning down a plea deal in 2018, a deal that would have required admitting guilt, which he wouldn't do.
Through all this media frenzy and legal back and forth, it's important we remember Hae Min Lee's family.
Yes. Our sources note they consistently maintained their belief in Adnan's guilt throughout all of this. The renewed attention must have been incredibly difficult.
Okay, so appeals exhausted, Supreme Court said no, conviction reinstated. Seems like the end of the legal line.
You'd think so. But then the focus shifted again. This time to DNA.
Ah, right. There have been talk about DNA testing for years.
Mm-hmm. And the sources say that Maryland prosecutors actually did run some tests back in mid-2018 on several items. Adnan Syed's DNA wasn't found on the specific items they tested then.
But more testing followed.
Yes. In March 2022, something pretty unusual happened. The state's attorney's office, the same office that prosecuted him and defended the conviction for years, joined with Syed's lawyer to ask for new DNA testing.
On items that hadn't been tested before.
Exactly. Things like Hae's clothing, her shoes, the rape kit samples. The judge approved it.
And then, just a few months later, September 2022, another bombshell.
A huge one. Prosecutors filed a motion to vacate Adnan Syed's conviction. The prosecution itself asked to throw out the conviction.
Why? What was their reasoning?
Two main things. Brady violations, meaning they believed the original prosecutors failed to disclose evidence favorable to the defense, and new evidence uncovered during their own recent reinvestigation.
What kind of evidence are we talking about?
They pointed to suppressed information about other potential suspects. They said the original team didn't disclose info about someone who had threatened his life and had the means and opportunity.
And they named alternate suspects.
Their motion identified two main alternate suspects. They mentioned things like one suspect having threatened Hae, her car being found near a relative's house of one suspect, and one suspect having later convictions for serial rape. They also, again, raised doubts about the reliability of the original cell phone records and witness testimony.
I remember there was some dispute about a note from the original prosecutor, Kevin Urich, related to the Brady claim.
Yes, that note became controversial. Urick disagreed with the state's attorney's interpretation of it regarding who it referred to. But the SA's office said their motion wasn't solely based on that note anyway.
So, based on this motion, citing suppressed evidence and new suspects, what did the judge do?
On September 19th, 2022, Judge Melissa Finn granted the motion. She vacated Adnan Syed's conviction.
And he was released.
That same day, walked out of prison after more than 20 years.
Then what happened with the charges?
A few weeks later, October 2022, the prosecutors formally dropped all charges, filed a nolle prosequi, case dismissed.
So, free man, charges dropped. Surely that was the end.
It really looked like it. For many people, that was the final chapter, but not quite.
Let me guess. Another appeal.
Exactly. Hae Min Lee's brother, Young Lee, appealed the decision to vacate the conviction.
On what grounds this time?
Victims' rights. He argued he wasn't given enough notice about the vacatur hearing to attend in person and wasn't given a proper chance to speak.
And did the appellate court agree?
They did. March 2023, in a 2-1 decision, they reinstated Adnan Syed's conviction.
Reinstated again. Unbelievable.
Correct. The court agreed Young Lee's rights as a victim representative were violated regarding notice and the opportunity to be present meaningfully at the hearing. They also criticized the prosecution's original motion to vacate for being too vague, like not naming the suspects or fully explaining why the conviction should be tossed.
So this ruling really put the focus on victims' rights in these kinds of post-conviction situations.
Very much so. It sparked a lot of debate about balancing those rights with the process for potentially innocent individuals.
Syed's team obviously fought this.
Yes, they asked the appellate court to reconsider, but were denied. So they took it back up to the Maryland Supreme Court in May 2023.
Okay, so back to the state's highest court again. What did they decide? August 2024.
Yet another split decision, 4-3. And yes, they again reinstated the murder conviction.
Good grief, it just keeps bouncing back. What was the reasoning this time? Was it still about the victims' rights issue?
Primarily, yes. The Supreme Court agreed that the 2022 hearing where the conviction was vacated was procedurally flawed because of the issues with notifying Young Lee and ensuring his right to be present.
But did they rule on the actual evidence?
Yeah.
The alternate suspects, the Brady claims?
No, importantly, they didn't rule on the merits of whether the conviction should be dismissed based on that evidence. They basically said the process was wrong, so the outcome, the vacatur, couldn't stand based on that flawed process.
So what did they order?
They ordered a new hearing back in the lower court to properly consider the state's original motion to dismiss the conviction, this time following all the correct procedures for victim notification. But crucially, while this new hearing was pending, Adnan Syed remained free.
Okay, so the conviction is technically back, but the core issue of whether it should be dismissed based on the new evidence is still supposed to be decided, and he's not in prison.
Exactly. Which brings us to the very final steps in this saga, according to our sources, happening in early 2025.
What happened with that new hearing that was ordered?
Well, in February 2025, the Baltimore State's attorney, Ivan Bates, made an announcement. His office was withdrawing the motion to vacate the conviction that they had filed back in 2022.
Withdrawing it. So basically taking back the request to dismiss the charges based on the Brady claims and new suspect.
Essentially, yes. It meant that the specific hearing ordered by the Supreme Court to reconsider that motion wouldn't happen because the motion itself was no longer active.
Didn't they still believe there were problems with the conviction? What happened next?
At the same time, the state's attorney said his office supported a different legal move by Syed's team. They were filing for a sentence reduction under a Maryland law called the Juvenile Restoration Act.
Ah, okay. Because Adnan was 17 when the crime happened.
Precisely. The law allows people who committed serious crimes as minors and have served a certain amount of time, I think it's 20 years in Maryland, to ask a judge to reduce their sentence.
So a hearing was held on that motion instead?
Yes, before Judge Jennifer Schiffer.
And the outcome? March 2025.
Judge Schiffer granted the motion. She reduced Adnan Syed's sentence to time served.
Okay, let's try to piece this final status together. The conviction for murder was reinstated by the Maryland Supreme Court.
Correct.
The motion to vacate that conviction based on new evidence, Brady, was withdrawn by the prosecution.
Also correct.
But his sentence was then reduced to the time he'd already spent in prison under the Juvenile Restoration Act.
Exactly.
So as things stand now, according to these sources, Adnan Syed is technically still convicted of Hae Min Lee's murder, but his sentence is complete, so he remains free.
That's the complex legal reality. Convicted but sentence served. It's a very unusual endpoint after such a long and convoluted journey.
Wow. Just recapping that path is dizzying. From the initial conviction, relying so heavily on Jay's testimony and that contested cell data,
Through all the post-conviction fights about the lawyer, the alibi, the cell tower reliability.
leading to the conviction being vacated in 2022 based on potential Brady violations, new suspects, DNA.
Only for that vacatur to be overturned on appeal due to victim notification procedural issues.
Twice, reinstating the conviction again and again.
Right, up until the final step where the sentence gets reduced based on his age at the time of the crime, leaving the conviction in place but effectively ending his time under state supervision.
This case really has touched on so many complex legal issues.
Yeah.
Evidence reliability, ineffective counsel standards, victims' rights versus potential innocence claims, DNA technology, just the sheer procedural maze of the justice system over decades.
Absolutely. It's a case study in how many different factors can influence the path of a case long after the initial trial.
So as you process all this information from our deep dive today, here's something to think about. How can a case with what seemed like a final conviction travel such an incredibly long and winding road? It reached multiple, often conflicting conclusions before landing in this specific legal limbo. Adnan Syed occupies now convicted, yet free because his sentence is deemed complete. What does this whole decades-long evolution suggest about our understanding of justice, the certainty of evidence, the power of doubt, and the way our legal system tries to navigate these incredibly difficult questions? Something to definitely mull over.